Welcome to Season 5 and to this week's ad break. The Beyond Solitaire podcast is still proudly sponsored by Central Michigan University's Center for Learning Through Games and Simulations. They've got some great stuff going on, starting with their booth at Gen Con. Please give them a visit at booth 6005 on the second floor near the Hyatt Skywalk, not too far from Paizo. You should also consider signing up for Damon Stone's game design class, which is being offered as part of CMU's Certificate in Applied Game Design. It's going to be amazing, and there will be a link in the show notes. Damon will be on the pod next week, so be on the lookout for that episode. CLGS also has a new game, Rising Waters, that will be on Kickstarter soon. Stay tuned for a start date and for my upcoming preview video. But for now, let's get on with the show.
Hey gamers, this is Liz Davidson from Beyond Solitaire, and I'm here to kick off Season 5 of the Beyond Solitaire podcast. And I can't actually believe that's a thing, but I have two extremely special guests today and a big piece of news. So everybody will recognize David Thompson, who actually closed off last season, and I pick on him every season. But we also have the privilege of talking to Dr. Reina Pennington, a history professor of Norwich University, and she is on here to consult with us about our very important next project. How are you doing today, Reina?
I'm doing fine. How are you?
I'm so happy that you're here. And David, how are you doing? I guess I'll ask.
Oh, yeah, awesome as always. Thanks for having me.
So, David, do you want to make our big announcement, or shall I?
I think you should.
Yeah. I should. Okay, so David's done this many times before, but I have not. We have decided that we are going to design a solo game together. And we are just starting that conversation right now with you, because that's obviously a great way to share your ideas when they're babies, not even existing, in front of a full audience. Very wise.
So now we're obligated.
Yes, we're forcing this to happen by having this conversation. And we have brought Dr. Pennington on to consult with us because she is, I would say, are you the world expert on the night witches?
Nobody should ever say anything like that, especially as a scholar. But I'm one of them, let's say.
So we want to make a game about the night witches, who are female pilots of Soviet Russia during World War II. And Reina wrote an amazing book about them called Wings, Women, and War, which I've been spending a lot of time with. And we've brought Reina on to actually talk to us about it. So Reina, do you want to give people just a basic primer on the night witches so they know what we're talking about?
Yes. So I guess I have to start off by saying there's a lot more than just the night witches. And so people use that word because it's the only thing they know about women who flew in combat, but that's just one of several units and lots of other women who were flying different kinds of airplanes. So there were 3 units formed in late 41 that were all female. One was, they were designated before they even started their training, that one would be all night bombers, the PO2 biplane. One would fly fighters in air defense, and one would be dive bombers. So they had all the women, ground crews and everything recruited for those 3 units. And so the unit that came to be known as the Night Witches was one of those 3. It came to be the 46 Guards, the Night Bomber Regiment later on. So a couple of things to note: a lot of the veterans that I had interviewed didn't really like the term Night Witches, and supposedly this was a name given to them by the Germans, but it's really hard to trace these things down because there were lots of night bomber units. So there were men, hundreds of men also flying night bombers in other regiments, and the poor suckers getting bombed on the ground are not going to know who's in the cockpit of this biplane going over them in the dark. So all these stories about the guys looking at the Germans looking up and seeing the night witches, I don't know how the hell they'd know who was bombing them actually, because there were lots of night bombers out there, but they were definitely exceptional in terms of being all female, flying throughout the entire war, 3 years of the war in some of the worst conditions you can imagine, setting all kinds of records. So they're definitely, an interesting and exceptional unit. But sometimes that leaves the other units in the dust. So you've got these women flying Yak fighters in air defense, and some of those women went on to fly at the front as well, because that unit was an air defense unit, not part of the normal front armies. So it was a little bit behind the lines protecting, train stations and things like that. But some of those women flew at Stalingrad in Yak fighters. And one woman got the first kills of any woman in combat there at Stalingrad at some of the worst times of the war. And then the other unit that flew the PE-2 dive bomber, they just were doing amazing things. And, that's maybe one of the riskiest missions of all and the most taxing and big, complicated airplane. So I go on about this all day, but I want to make sure that all these people get their due because they're so interesting and they were all doing very different things in different places at the front. And there were also women who were not in those particular units that were just flying in the regular Soviet Air Force scattered here and there. So there's lots of interesting things about, aviation in general, but about the women pilots in particular. So I don't know where you guys plan to go with that. If you particularly wanted to focus on the night bombers, because that's obviously the title that people know, or if you wanted to try to bring in some of these other things going on too.
What do you think, David? I'm personally of the opinion that I'm interested in female pilots, but not necessarily a specific unit.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, from a practical perspective, I guess it just depends. And really, this is the conversation we're having today is where is the game, right? And, a game that encompasses all three would be a very different game that one that encompasses one of the three regiments. It's an interesting, this is going to sound just talking out loud here and not hiding my, like found by the capitalist world of board game, sales and stuff. One idea would be you make a game about the night witches, and if people are interested in it, then it opens up the opportunity to delve into the lesser known ones too, right? So and I do know one thing that Liz and I, we've talked very little about this, but one thing we definitely share is the desire that whatever game we come up with that we've talked about it being a solo or co-op game is something it's broadly accessible. We don't want this to be a game that's just for super hardcore war gamers, something that a broad audience can get into.
Yeah, this actually led me to one question, which is, okay, so if Night Witches is a title that a lot of the veterans you spoke to don't like, is there one that they do like? Is there anything they call themselves typically?
Pilots.
Just pilots.
Navigators. Yeah. I think, a lot of them are pretty adamant. And the units were not even called women's regiments. So they weren't in any way distinguished from other units, except in the way that they were initially recruited. So they had the same pay, the same uniforms, the same planes. They were part of the same command structure. They were just regular military people. So I don't think they usually would distinguish themselves as being anything separate.
One real quick question. I just wanted to pull a thread on something that I've heard conflicting. What was the 586? So those were the defensive fighters, right? And the 587th were the dive bombers. That's correct?
Yes.
Were they all female the whole time, or was it just the Night Witches that were an all-female regiment?
Just the Night Witches after the first year. Okay. So when they were first recruited, it was all female from the ground crews and admin through all the flying positions as well. So from tooth to tail, everything was female. But the problem was this was a kind of an idea to get some people in the field in a hurry, and women were not being recruited systematically. So there was a particular famous pilot, Marina Raskova, that had the idea for this. They gave her the approval, and they got these 3 units into training and out in the field. And from that point on, they were just part of the Air Force, and they didn't have any pipeline to provide more women into those units in particular, although sometimes that happened just through individual orders. So there are 2 things that happened. First of all, when they were still in training, the dive bomber unit changed aircraft. So they were initially supposed to fly an older model dive bomber, and then the PE-2 came out, and that meant their air crew had to go from 2 people to 3 people, kind of like right before they were getting ready to go to the front. And they needed new engineers and mechanics that knew a little bit more about this particular aircraft, and they didn't have time to retool everything and wait for more women to be trained. So they brought in some men. The interesting thing in the dive bomber unit is that 95% of the air crews were women. So the pilots and navigators were all women. They brought men in for the new third position, which was a gunner, communicator, gunner radio operator. And then there were a few ground crew that came in to help out. And the fighter unit ended up with some men because when the Soviet Union rebounded from the initial losses, it expanded the size of all of its aviation regiments. So they went from 2 regiments or 2 squadrons to 3. And to get people in there fast enough to fill out the regiment, they brought in male pilots for that. So the 46 managed to stay all female, and the unit was initially called the 588. So these were the 588th, 587th, 586, 587th, and 588th. And then 2 of them became guard units. And so that's the number they prefer, so 588th becomes the 46 guards later on. But yeah, they managed to avoid all that through some really ingenious methods of training up people, because they could always get women mechanics and women armorers, because you didn't have to have a college degree and things like that. So they could bring these women in those other positions, and then they would actually train them up to become navigators and train navigators to become pilots. So no other unit did that I know of. And the commander of that unit, Bershanskaya, is a really interesting person. So she created this off the cuff training squadron so that she created her own pipeline. And that's how they stayed all female. And they're very proud of the fact that they are the only all female regiment through the whole war.
When I read about that sort of graduated training program, so Reina and I were both prior Air Force, right? And so could you imagine in our modern Air Force, the idea that you would have enlisted ground crew who would be promoted into navigators like on the fly like that? Like it's just such a foreign concept when I read about that opportunity. So I thought that was really cool.
Yeah, it is. It's very unusual. And that commander was kind of unusual. She wasn't regular Air Force. She had been in civil aviation before the war, but she just decided to give this a try. She didn't really ask anybody, and it was working, and they let her do it.
That's so interesting. One thing I've also been noticing as I read your book is that the women who participated in these units really wanted it. And in fact, there was an initial reluctance to let them participate, and even earlier on to let them attend flight classes. And I think it's really interesting. There's like sort of a weird tension between, women having to really fight to get into these positions they wanted to be in, and then also government willingness to capitalize on them as propaganda when they succeed. So how's that working?
Yeah, and it is interesting, the Soviet Union, because there were no real legal barriers. And so there were women in the Air Force, and there had been women in the Red Army in the Civil War era as well. So they were willing to use women in combat in a lot of ways. And so people like Marina Raskova, she was the first female navigator in the Soviet Air Force in early 1930s, when that just became a career field. So she'd been around, but a lot of women had some trouble getting into just basic flight training. There's nothing against it, but just individual people will kind of try to discourage them and say, there's other things you should do. And the same thing with the military academies. So you had to be really persistent. Some women got in that way, but you had this kind of backlog of trained pilots. And that's what Raskova wanted to draw on, because she knew all these women were out there who had made it through the various systems, even if they hadn't gotten into the military. And she wanted to use them because the Soviet Union needed them.
The other thing I noticed was that it seems like these flights were extremely repetitive, extremely stressful. And that's actually another point where I think maybe there's a game there. I was watching an interview on YouTube with a veteran who said that she had known a girl who did 7 flights in a row, where she would go bomb, come back, she would be like freaked out, like shaking. They would reload her plane with bombs and fuel, and she would just get back in and go back out. So is that, what kind of conditions were these people flying under? You said horrible. When you say like, well, they were flying under really tough conditions, like what exactly does that mean?
Boy, there's a lot in what you just said there. So Well, see, yeah, because of the different kinds of aircraft, you have very different missions and very different flight durations. So the dive bombers might fly 1 or 2 sorties a day, but they're longer sorties because they had a longer range and they had a bigger capacity. They could hold more bombs. The fighters might fly 2, 3, sometimes 4 sorties a day. And they were kind of in the middle in terms of range. And then the night witches or the night bombers, the PO2 didn't have much of a range at all. It's a biplane, and it certainly didn't have much carrying capacity either. So, and that's why they're stationed in such interesting places. So the PO2s had to stay very close to the front lines. So they're often only 30 or 40 kilometers away from the front. And because their missions are going to be less than an hour, less than 45 minutes, and sometimes half an hour, they just go out and back and out and back. So because of that, they could fly many more times a day, but they can only fly in the dark because they're too vulnerable to enemy fighters and anti-air in the daylight, because they just have no defenses and they go too slow. It's a terrible target from their point of view. So the number of sorties depended on the day length. And the longer the nights, the more the sorties. So the more sorties are flown in the winter in a biplane, of course, which is really interesting. So you're also talking about these planes coming. Everyone's flying from grass fields, right? There's almost no prepared airstrips that anybody's using in this war. So they're flying off grass fields, which makes it really interesting for lighting a runway and getting people in. And so these biplanes come in, as you said, they get turned. They might, bring the air crew some hot tea, and the mechanics are out there, hurriedly refueling and reloading, and then they get them back out. So on what they call nights of maximal effort, each crew might fly 10 to 15 sorties, because you could have 14 hours of darkness. More typically it might be 6 or 8, a little less in the summer. And that's how you got, that's why there were so many heroes of the Soviet Union awarded to pilots and navigators in the 46, because they just had incredible numbers of flights. They never left the front. So these people never got leave. They were there for 3 years. They flew straight through. So there were pilots with 1,000 sorties, with 1,000 combat missions in the war. And it wasn't unusual to have 700 or 800.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you about those numbers. So I think the number I saw was around 2,400 missions flown. Is that about right? Or am I off on that?
Oh, I think what you're thinking of is 24,000
24,000 total missions.
Yeah,
Sorry.
total missions for the 46.
Okay. So 24,000 total missions and 30-ish pilots and navigators lost. Does that sound right?
Yes.
Okay.
So I don't have the number right in front of me, but yeah, something like that.
Okay. So when you think of it in those terms, 24,000 missions, 30 crew lost, that doesn't sound like a lot of crew lost. But how many total crew were? Because when you start talking about, well, individual people were flying hundreds and hundreds of missions, that could we put that number in context as to what the total number of personnel might have been?
Yeah, so a regiment typically had 3 squadrons. And a squadron would have roughly 10 aircraft. These things varied a lot during time and place. And then there's a lot of non-operationally ready stuff at any given time. But generally speaking, the regiment might have, let's say, 40-ish pilots, and the same navigators if it was, the night bombers or the dive bombers. So fighters just had pilots.
Wow. I have a series of questions, Liz. I don't know if we want to hold off on this or not, about some specifics from like the tactical level perspective about some of these, as it relates primarily to the night witches, because that's what I've been mostly, looking into. But is that okay if you want to dive into that now?
Yeah, I want to know.
Okay. All right. So if you, and this, like, from a tactics evolution perspective, I think there's some really interesting things about what happened with the night witches, right? So they start out, and there's this idea that, the very, as you said, they're operating very close to the front. They're flying these biplanes, which the Germans weren't familiar with engaging early on, right? At least. And their primary threat was the combination of searchlights and anti-aircraft weapons, right?
Yes.
so they would have this tactic, and please correct me where I'm wrong or elaborate, please. But they would have this tactic where they would come in, they would bomb, and the Germans had to kind of learn how to deal with this unique sort of approach that the Night Witches had, right?
Mhm.
And so then there's the introduction of air interceptors by the Germans, right? And so the Night Witches, nighttime
Night fighters,
right? And so the Night Witches had to learn how to deal with that. And so I was just curious, like, what were the countermeasures that the Night Witches developed to deal with night fighters?
Oh gosh, that's a good question. There's not a lot you can do to counter night fighters if you're up there in a biplane. And it was pretty rare for the Germans to have night fighters in the same area, but there was one horrendous time. The first time that the 46 encountered them, 46 was flying down in the Caucasus. So this is, of course, what the Battle of Stalingrad's all about, is actually the Caucasus and the oil in the Caucasus. And in 43, it could be interesting possibly for you, because both the 46th and the 125th are in that same area, in the Transcaucasus area, which just has horrendously awful weather, the just winds and storms and all kinds of things, and mountainous side effects for depending where you're flying. So there's just awful things going on there. And in that kind of weather, especially at night, you don't usually see night fighters. I mean, nobody's got great night fighters in World War II. The capabilities are not good for them. You just don't have the equipment that you need. So they were pretty unusual, although some did operate. But it was down in the Caucasus on one night, and completely unexpected, that 4 of the aircraft in the 46 got shot down. So that's 8 crews. And it happened in such rapid succession because typical formation coming in, you don't fly formation at night, right? So you space your aircraft out 2 or 3 minutes, single aircraft at a time coming in. But that means you've still got a long train of aircraft in the air going slowly. And if you can get searchlights on them, then the night fighter can really do damage in a big hurry. As far as countermeasures for something like that, well, the biggest countermeasure is to take out the searchlights and just not to fly if there are night fighters in the area. And if that was known, that would happen too, because the only advantage the biplane has is it can go lower and slower, so it can turn faster than a fighter. So sometimes it can force a fighter to overshoot. It can operate down around tree line, which is going to be difficult for the fighter. Just try to get down in the weeds. And a lot of times there might even be, like, depending on the conditions, you might try to make an emergency landing, just to get away from the fighter. You certainly can't outrun it.
Yeah, no, that's super interesting. And you touched on this a little bit, how much targeting of searchlights and I guess maybe flat guns, but that seems super dangerous, would Night Witches do in preparation, like, to allow for following aircraft to have an easier approach?
Well, ideally, you're going to hand off some of those missions to the Army. So you're going to use some artillery for that. You can use dive bombers also, to some of the bombers that can come in the daylight and take out, especially AAA positions. Searchlights are tougher, they move around more, and you're not necessarily going to have any idea where they are. So and we should stress again, not just the Night Witches are doing these things. All the night bombers are developing these kinds of tactics. So one thing they would do was to try to take out the searchlights, and that's simply a matter of, if a searchlight gets turned on, then one of the aircraft in the formation would be designated, and sometimes every other aircraft. Okay, you go for the target, you go for the searchlight, you go for the target, you go for the searchlight.
Okay. No, that's interesting. That actually segues brilliantly into a follow-up question I had about how were they doing intel gathering, I guess, on the targets, right? And the defenses, and how are they doing mission planning, if such a thing was existing at the time, in detail?
Yeah, obviously you had to work pretty closely with the Army, and there's some really interesting stuff that happened again down on the Kerch Peninsula and Taman Peninsula. The night witches are flying down there trying to support amphibious troops and naval troops in these actions that are going back and forth across this access to the Crimean Peninsula. So it was really critical territory. And so they're trying to get in there and support these, these troops, some of whom they had met and known because they interacted before the missions went in. So there was a planning process, and it got better and better. It wasn't as great as it should have been in the early part of the war. But 43 is kind of the turnaround period. By 44, things are much better shape in terms of combined arms operations and interactions, really close interactions between aviation commanders and army commanders. Army unit commanders. So you'd be planning during the day. Intel varied widely. For intel, your best bet was probably reconnaissance aircraft. But then you had to disseminate the information out to the field. And that was a real problem early in the war. Into 43, there were still a lot of issues with radios. You didn't have really good forward air control. That changes by 44. But, so the time period that you look at is really important. And, I don't know if you're going to try to cover a long time period, but operations in 42 and 43 are just so drastically different from what you've got in 44 and 45 that you can really hardly compare them. So there is this evolution of tactics. But the really cool thing, I think, is that there's this tactics dissemination process where they send pilots around to talk to other units and talk about their experiences. So, some guy that's got some kills, like Pakrishkin, they'll just send out and around.
And then I guess moving away from that just a little bit, but since on the topic of the night fighters being forced to fight near the front lines, and then having these sort of grassy airfields and stuff, it seems to me like they would be very vulnerable to attack by the Germans. And I was curious, what do they have ground-based air defenses or some sort of air defenses that were guarding their airfields from German attack?
They do, but most, especially the 46, the night bombers, are moving so often and not using any kind of prepared facilities. So they would usually have some AAA, but maybe not much more beyond that.
Okay. No, that's awesome. I think that gives us, at least for me, that gives me interesting insight into like the tactical level engagement stuff. And we've all sort of hinted around at some of the what I would call operational level, like all of the, operational readiness, maintenance, what we just talked about, ground-based air defense of the airfield. I think that's an interesting, and you don't hear it talked about nearly as much, right? These, just as much as the ground crew or the navigators and pilots were being pushed, the ground crews had to also be maintaining these aircraft. And I can't imagine what doing all the maintenance on these aircraft that are flying, just constant missions must have been like.
Yeah, and we talked briefly about the whole logistics of this thing. So, think about doing that too while you're moving airfields. So for the night bombers, they move with the front. So if the front's kind of stationary, like in the Caucasus, they might not move quite so often. But once they start going west, they could be moving, every few days or every couple of weeks. And even the air defense place had to rebase a lot. That unit was moving forward. So every time you change, just think about the logistics of taking everything you need, going somewhere else, and setting up not only airfield defenses, but just all the stuff you need to keep the airplanes going, and then quarters for all the pilots and trying to feed everybody and getting the food moved and getting the munitions moved and oil and fuel and things that you need is just a huge undertaking. So yeah, those are really the unsung heroes in so many ways. People doing that.
That is amazing. And then I think that these night raids sound really interesting, but I just want to probe. So if I remember correctly, Marina Raskova, who's like the most famous pilot, was not a night flyer. She was doing daytime bombing. Is that correct?
Oh, Marina Raskova.
Yeah.
Raskova died before she got into combat.
Oh, wow. So basically she put all this together and she never actually got to fly.
Yeah, she got killed in a crash in a blizzard. On on her way from the training unit to where she took over command of the 125th, the dive bombers. That's what she wanted to do.
Gotcha.
And so they were all going down there, and a small group of the aircraft got hit with this, blizzard, and her airplane crashed. And so everyone was killed. Ironically, just a year before that, the guy who designed that airplane, Petliakov, he was killed the same way.
Oh,
So,
wow.
this was, because some people have tried to say, well, she must not have been a very good pilot, but she was a pretty decent pilot. And, if the aircraft designer was killed the same way in a blizzard in January, it wasn't that unusual for accidents to happen. So you got to account for that in your losses, in addition to just, getting shot down.
Yeah, and she'd already had an incredible survival story from flying the longest flight, right?
Right. So one of the record-setting flights in 1938 that she was on, it was an aircraft with 3 people, a crew of 3 women, and they ran out of fuel. They were flying from Moscow to Siberia, ran out of fuel, had to ditch the airplane, and so Raskova had to jump out because of her position in the airplane, and it was to lighten the load. And so she got separated from the plane and spent 10 days in September and October 1938 wandering around with no food. And fortunately managed the search crews managed to find them. And that's how she became a hero of the Soviet Union. So yeah, she was tough. It's a damn shame we didn't get to see what she did in combat.
Yeah, no kidding. Yeah, I remember reading that she got in command, but I'm only up to like a certain year in my reading. So that's a sad spoiler, but it happens. But yeah, I mean, and also I guess I want to know, I mean, I'm looking for like the human elements of things too, because I think that a combination of operational and emotional like makes me the happiest in my games. So the other thing is, Stalin was acquainted with and in communication with some of these women, at least early on.
Raskova. Yeah, after that, I'm not sure he was still in any direct contact any longer. But because she was a superstar like Amelia Earhart, she had been to the Kremlin, and so yeah, he knew Raskova and her co-pilots, and but yeah, he didn't seem to have much direct contact after that.
Interesting. And then I guess
but there were other superstars, Army, Air Army commanders. There's some really interesting people in that group, which would be an interesting level of command to bring in too.
Interesting. So we're talking about women in those positions?
No. So in Soviet Air Force structure, you've got your basic unit regiment, which is more like what we would call a squadron, and you might have a division, and then above that, normally you went straight to the Air Army level, and they had 16 Air Armies by the end of the war, and they would shuffle these Air Armies around as the fronts moved, so they weren't permanently attached to any ground unit. For the most part, the 3 so-called women's regiments were not in the same place at the same time, but the night bombers and dive bombers were both in the Caucasus and in the same Air Army for quite some months or a year.
And another question, kind of looking for that human element. I know that a lot of your work was interviews with veterans, and so I guess when we talk about making a game about them and about their experiences, what can you tell the most from your interviews about how they want to be remembered, and what kind of representation of them would be something that honored them as opposed to something that annoyed them?
Yeah, that's good, because sometime I'll tell you about how my book cover was almost a disastrous thing that would have really pissed them all off, but fortunately we got that fixed. So yeah, I think you have to remember, this is the Soviet Union in the 1940s, and there wasn't the kind of awareness of things like women's issues, or that we're out there representing women in particular, although they were very aware of being judged on the fact that they were women and might not perform as well as men. But I wouldn't say that a lot of them that wasn't their first mission. Their first mission was defending their homeland. Their country had been invaded. Many of them had lost people they knew, might have families in occupied areas. I mean, it was a very personal thing. And I didn't see much difference at all between the men I interviewed and the women I interviewed in what their motivations were. And as far as how they want to be remembered, I think they just want to be remembered at all, because far from being a big propaganda event, a lot of these women were barely known in the Soviet Union. And by the time I started interviewing them in the early 90s, they'd just been forgotten. In their own country, they felt like people didn't remember them or remember World War II much either. So I think it's like most of us, you want to be recognized for your accomplishments. And I think they have maybe not. I started to say a stronger feeling about their collective and their unit. But, I'm the historian for the Aggressor Alumni Association, which was one of my squadrons in the Air Force, a squadron that simulated Soviet tactics. And we definitely have a very strong feeling about our collective and our identity as part of that group too. So maybe that's not so unique to the Soviet Union, but they definitely, they want it to be known that there was a role that they played in this major event. And from their point of view, one of the most important roles in saving the world from fascism, because where the hell were the Americans for most of this war? They weren't around as far as the Red Army was concerned. Even Lend-Lease doesn't kick in until late 43, really on a significant level. They all remember spam, so you better put spam in the game, because it's like everyone's favorite thing are some of the American trucks, Jeeps, and spam. They all remember that.
I do. I mean,
that could be a big bonus in your logistics chain somewhere. Big morale goes up.
Yeah, I know that this is a I don't know, nebulous or ambiguous kind of question, but on this topic of not them really fighting to defend the homeland, not really fighting for women's issues, which is like, as we now look back historically, that's the thing that it resonates more now maybe than it did then at the time, right? In some ways. But it's one thing that's a little bit difficult for me to try to sift through between like the elements that were a little bit propagandized. Is there a sentiment, like a level of sentiment that we can determine from the military, the actual like military working with the women, the male military members working with the women? Was it a level of resentment, of respect? I mean, certainly for the units where men were part of it, that seems they were integrated, right? But for like the Night Witches, which was an all women's unit, do we have a level of understanding about what that sentiment generally was?
Yeah. And just before I forget, one interesting thing is that, so some of these regiments would be based with other regiments at the same airfield, especially if they got to a big facility or a prepared facility that they took over as they're moving west. So you'd have a so-called women's regiment. Remember, two of those have some men too. And then you'd have just regular Air Force. Well, they're all regular Air Force, but you'd have another regiment or two maybe at the same airfield. So you're flying together, you're sharing the same mess, things like that. So one of the interesting things about the dive bombers, about the 125th, is that for a span of time, I don't know if you've heard of the French aviation unit that flew in the Red Army.
No.
The Normandy Niemann squadron. So there's a squadron of French pilots, fighter pilots, who go and fight in the Red Army, and they were flying escort for the 125th and other dive bombers in that division. So this would have been late 43, early 44. And so the Normandy Niemann pilots became quite famous, because they're French fighter pilots, and they got a lot of propaganda attention, but their memoirs are out. And so it's really interesting because, people I interviewed remembered them, and there was a couple of veterans meetings later on where some of them got back together. But that could be an interesting scenario too, where you've got these French fighter pilots and
that's cool,
and the women in the PE-2 dive bombers. But yeah, as far as men's attitudes are really interesting thing, and that's easy to track down at individual levels. And I've also done some work on women in the Red Army, where there's a little bit more to work with in terms of women in command positions and things like that. The Air Force was maybe a little less resistant. I mean, you get in this piece of equipment and you either perform well or you don't. And, there's more precedent there perhaps, but I think, it's a general principle in sociology, and I think it's true, which is that if you get to 15 or 20%, you're no longer a minority, you're more integrated and accepted. But if your numbers are below that, it's easy for people to regard you as an anomaly and something freakish almost. So what I found was when I've come across really negative things that any men said about women in the Red Army, it was usually men who didn't have any personal experience with women. And for the men who were with women in units, sometimes, they'd say, well, she's okay, even if I don't think this is really what women should be doing. Or else they'd just say, yeah, we're all fighting together, and that's important. So it was a matter of personal exposure, I think. And it seemed that most of the people that were in some integrated manner of combat thought that was pretty cool, except for the night witches, who are just like, no, damn it, we're all women and we're better because of that.
That's awesome too. So what is the most dramatic story any of the people that you interviewed told you?
The most dramatic story?
Yeah, like the most riveting, memorable thing.
Oh gosh. I don't have any of the details on me right now, but I think one thing that really sticks out for me is an incident in the 125th, the dive bomber unit. So the PE2s normally fly in a 9-ship formation, three sections of 3. That was just standard in many air forces at the time to provide the optimal cover. And once they're on a mission, and by the way, these are big missions. So, you might have a 9-ship, you could do 27 of those from one regiment, and then you might have several regiments involved. I mean, you could have like huge mass attacks of these things, going in waves, and then their fighter cover and everything too. But one of the PE2s got shot up and had to maneuver, and so they're kind of flipping around, well, they're not flipping around with PE2, but they're jinking and trying to figure out what kind of damage they'd taken from, I think it was AAA. And the pilot noticed there's no comms with the gunner, and this was a female gunner in this case, and they can't get any communication from her. The gunner's in a separate little bubble, and they look back and see that the bubble had just been blown away. And as far as they can tell, she just was gone. She was sucked out of the airplane. Well, it turned out that when she came out, she grabbed something on the outside of the airplane. So she's like hanging on to this, I don't know if it was a little antenna or wiring or something, but she was hanging on to something out there. And, the planes, they think she's gone. The plane's leveling off. They're like, oh my God, what's happening? The pilot navigator, and this gunner then, as things calm down a bit, manages to pull herself back into
Oh my goodness.
the where the bubble had been, into her hatch, and gets back on the comms and says, hey, guess what? I'm actually here.
Wow.
Oh my
That's
God.
amazing. That's like that's like a scene out of a movie, and you're like, come on, that's unrealistic.
There are so many stories like that. And the problem I have with the novel is you just can't write anything better than what actually happened.
Right. Yeah.
So I'm trying to base everything on what really happened, because, there's so much to work with.
Yeah, so let's actually take a step. So Reina is
Let me just
writing
tell you
a
one other
novel.
thing. Oh, this just reminded me too. But so a kind of cool thing was if somebody got shot down, the airplane, where they had to make an emergency landing, other people would try to get in and pick them up, especially if they're behind enemy lines. So it might be in a PO2, it might be in another fighter. Often it would be in another fighter. You had a couple of instances that I've seen in the fighter units, and once with one of the female pilots, where she crash landed. Another Yak fighter came in, landed in that field, and somehow they crammed her in the cockpit with the other guy, with the pilot. And this didn't just happen with her, this happened with male pilots too. They'd rescue each other, but you'd be cramming 2 people into one fighter to get out of there and save the pilot.
Wow.
I mean, I've never seen that in a film, I don't think.
So
Yeah, that's amazing.
you're writing a novel. Take a moment to plug it, since it's come up, since I'm personally looking forward to this novel.
Yeah. Well, I have a lot of words on paper. I've been working on this. I don't know if anyone's heard of NaNoWriMo, National Novel Writing Month. So I decided about 5 years ago, I'd give that a try just to see if there was, anything to work with in this idea. So since then, I've gotten into this. This thing's going to have to be a trilogy, I think, because I went from one point of view character to 6, because I wanted to write about Lidbyak, but she dies in August of 43, and I just didn't want to change that. She died, so I'm not going to make her live. But then somebody has to tell the story. So I ended up adding other characters, including Raskova and the commander-in-chief of the Soviet Air Forces, Novikov, who's a really interesting guy too. And so now I've got all these people I'm weaving through these different times and places and timelines and maps. And, because again, the basis is in reality. But my challenge now that I just retired and have this year to work on this is figuring out the structure, making a novel and not a history. But I wanted to do the novel because there's not enough in any one story to do a real biography. But you don't want these stories to be lost, like the women feared. So tentatively called Stalin's Falcons. Look for it sometime in another year or two.
Oh, that's awesome. So where does the Falcons come from? Is that a historical thing, or is it part of your?
So Stalin's Falcons was something that actually was used to refer to the Soviet Air Force. Sometimes you would see eagles and other terms, like any Air Force, they're all going to be connected to birds of prey, but Stalin's Falcons was one of the most common.
Interesting. So I have a question. So we talked a lot about sort of the tactical peculiarities of doing night raids, but the dive bombers have also come up a couple of times. If we were going to focus on them, how would that look different? What were their missions like?
Their missions could be anything from a lot of railway activity, both the stations and junctions, and then trains, because that's carrying all the supplies the Germans needed. They might be used against some big collection of troops, troop concentrations or headquarters in particular. If there were fixed targets that they could hit, that would be great. There are more of those increasingly as you got closer into the German homeland and things like that. They went through a lot of interesting things in terms of tactics, because it's a dive bomber. They're most effective when used in a fairly steep dive, which takes a hell of a lot of tactics and training. It's the hardest thing you can probably do. So it's like a high G event. You go into this steep dive, but you can hit the target. You're coming in lower, so it's more risky, and you're moving fast, but you can still be taken out by enemy ground fire. So that's the way these planes are supposed to be used. But a lot of, they had trouble in the Soviet Air Forces getting anyone trained to that level in such a fast time, because it's a brand new airplane and nobody had the time. They had to go fight every day. So a lot of times these bombers are also being used as more of a kind of level, medium altitude kind of bombing. There's no strategic bombing. Neither Germans nor the Soviets have any kind of strategic bombers, like big multi-engine, heavy payload kind of bombers. So these are light bombers, more tactical bombers, but so you had different kinds of missions for the different areas. And then, things varied a lot too, depending on the season. Winter and summer bombing are really different. The airplanes get painted differently, which is always kind of interesting. I think, the dive bombers are interesting because they change munitions more than the others, because you have a much bigger variety of munitions you can drop, rockets and anti-personnel stuff, and different kinds of payloads you can put on the dive bombers that you don't have a whole lot of options on the biplanes. When you start out, they're just like lobbing things over from the cockpit. Let's drop some flares, and we can punch off these couple of bombs that are hanging out on the wings, and that's about it.
That's so scary and also oddly charming. Just think of like
I mean, it was crazy, from anyone's point of view, to be sitting in an open cockpit biplane in the middle of winter. Can you just imagine in Russian winter conditions what it's like, flying without wind and cold temperatures, and no parachutes and no heaters, and it was pretty primitive.
All right. So, David, do you have any other pressing questions at this time?
I'm sure I will have many more follow-up questions. I think we hit all the main big things that I wanted to ask about for now anyway. I know that you're going to ask, what have you been playing? And I'm eager to hear that question, but that is your question to ask, not mine. So
yes, I love that part of this conversation. So, Reina, one of the other reasons that we are so happy to have you talking to us about this is that you too are a solo gamer, just
I
like
am.
us. So, what have you been playing recently?
Recently, I was just playing Under Falling Skies.
Ooh, yes.
Yeah, and I was just lately, because I'm in the process of moving, and it's been really stressful. I've just been looking for some kind of light, quick games, So, my standby would be something like Friday.
oh yes,
Under Falling Skies. I love Robinson Crusoe, but damn, I just can't win that thing to save my life. Just got a copy of Coffee Roasters, which I've never tried before. But now when I want something bigger, I'm still a big fan of Spirit Island.
Nice. These are all extremely rock solid solo game
yes.
You have excellent taste.
Yeah, you just ripped off a ton of like fantastic games. That's amazing.
And
a lot of Pavlov's House. But last semester I taught a whole course on Stalingrad, on the Battle of Stalingrad. So I'm a little bit played out on that for the moment. So, so looking forward to trying something, although damn, you pick some of the most depressing topics, don't you, Dave?
I do.
Those Polish postmen, I just haven't brought myself to dealing. I'm already dealing with a scenario where, not everyone dies, but a hell of a lot of people die. And that's one of these days we'll have a conversation about why you chose a scenario like that. I know I've seen some people complain about how are you supposed to win this game? Everybody dies.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, winning is all relative. But I will say that on that topic specifically, like that last phase of that game, when your goal is just to get anybody out of the post office to escape alive, and you have the custodian, his wife, and their daughter, and you are just desperate. Like that is the sort of moral victory in that game, is if they can get out alive, then it doesn't matter whether you win or lose the game, right?
Oof. That's some rough stuff. Yeah, I like my games a little depressing too, it's true. So David, what have you been playing?
I have been, this is going to sound self-serving, it's just honest. I've played Sniper Elite nonstop because it just came out and my kids are obsessed with it. So it's like we played 2 games last night, but my 11-year-old and 8-year-old are just, that's all they want to play. So I've been playing a lot of my own game. I did play one game I always love to mention. This is not a solo game, despite the podcast, but French and Indian War 1757 through 1759 is a Worthington game, block war game. And there's a lot of block war games, and I like block war games. But the cool thing about this one is it has simultaneous written order resolution. So each player writes where their blocks are going to go. And so I just love that. That's like a very unusual thing that you see in very few games. And I just love the way that resolves. So.
Nice. And so this is not going to air for about another month, but yeah, so I'm about to film Sniper Elite this weekend. So Reina, I know that you are going to be writing and being very busy, but if people want to contact you, is there a way to find you online?
Oh, sure. I have a website, reinapennington.com. And you can always email me through my Norwich address, which is just look me up, Reina Norwich.
Excellent. And then David,
where do you put it below, I guess, on this for people that ever look at that anymore?
Yeah, it'll definitely be in the show notes. David, we've talked about this before. Where do you like to be contacted?
Probably Twitter is the best. It's at D.Jack Thompson. Or if people want, they can look me up on Board Game Geek and just email me there.
Awesome. And then I, of course, can be found everywhere as Beyond Solitaire. So look for me and drop me a line. Thank you so much to both of you for coming on to help me kick off season 5 of this podcast. This conversation was awesome, and I just really am excited about what's going to happen next.
Great. Thanks for asking me. It was a lot of fun.
Yep. Thanks as always.
All right, so we had David Thompson and Dr. Reina Pennington. Everyone, please like, subscribe, comment, find us somewhere because we want to talk to you about Russian female pilots. Thanks so much for watching, everybody, and happy gaming.